All right, why don't we start? On behalf of CFOG, the Connecticut Foundation for Open Government, I would like to welcome everyone to this year's event, The Stories Behind the Biggest Stories of the Past Year. My name is Bill Fish, and I have the honor of being the current president of CFOG. This year's event, even though it had to be virtual, is particularly important and timely given the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic obviously has affected all of us in countless ways, but it certainly did not stop the world from turning and the news from continuing. Indeed, if anything, the pandemic simply generated more stories and more materials that the press had to cover. And of course, the pandemic made that work immeasurably more difficult. And tonight, we are so fortunate to have 9 consummate professionals who will tell their stories to us about how they investigated, covered, reported on, photographed, and told to us, audience, some of the biggest stories of 2020. As you listen to their stories tonight, I encourage you to focus on how their already very difficult jobs were just made so much harder because of the pandemic. As consumers of the news, we all benefit immensely from news stories, photographs, news videos, and the seamless ease with which they appear in our papers and on our screens. But of course, that ease is really the result of hard work and immense talent behind the scenes. And tonight, we're all privileged to get a glimpse into that backstage world as it existed in 2020 through the eyes and the lives of our extraordinary panelists. An event like this takes a village to put together. So before I turn it over to them, let me just thank the committee who had both the vision and the energy to make tonight a reality. Michelle Jacqueline, Paul Gajira, Paul Marks, Bob Fram, Len Bestoff, and then Kate Farish and David Fink, who led this effort. I'd also like to thank Rachel Sonatas and Lee Hudson from my firm, Hinckley Allen, who are making all this happen behind the scenes. At the end of tonight's presentation, there'll be an opportunity for chat questions, written questions, and Kate and David will help monitor that. So I'd like you to sit back, enjoy, and finally, if you're so inclined, please consider a donation to CFOG to help support our mission of educating the citizens of Connecticut on the importance of open government and freedom of the press. Now, let me introduce our moderator, who we're so excited to welcome back for return engagement, Leslie Mays from NBC 30, who's going to introduce our panelists and explain how our program will work tonight. Leslie?
Bill, thank you. And thank you to everyone at CFOG for having me back again this year. Last year was my first experience with this event, Stories Behind the Stories. And I had a great experience. It was a really fun panel, learned a lot, met some new folks, and it was exciting. And we'll be again this year to share some of the behind the scenes and inner workings of the work that we all do as journalists. Last year's event also precipitated what was the next day a very big news day for a lot of us. So, knock on wood that maybe we will or we will not have something super exciting that happens tomorrow, but we shall see. 2020 and now 2021 are giving us a lot to think about already. So I just want to jump right into things and introduce our panel, and then we'll get started with the questions. So joining us tonight, we have Rick Green from the Hartford Courant, Sarah Gordon from The Day, everyone can believe, Daniela Altamari from the Hartford Courant also, Brian Didlake from Fox 61. We have Kayla Torres Ocasio from Hearst Media, Mark Pazniokis, lots of people may have heard on a governor's press conference, referred to as Paz, from the Connecticut Mirror. We also have Christine Stewart from CT News Junkie, who also does some work with us at NBC Connecticut, and Jacqueline Robb Thomas, also from the Connecticut Mirror. So Rick, Sarah, Danielle, I want to get started with you guys and talk some about kind of the logistics of just working in 2020 and, being in a newsroom, the things that you guys covered, or maybe weren't in a newsroom, the things that you guys covered over 2020. What was it like dealing with the pandemic and all that we endured last year?
I think I'm supposed to go first, Leslie, so I'll lead off. At the Hartford Courant, my job is basically to keep the trains running, which translates to harassing reporters and keeping them on stories. When the pandemic struck, we were probably mostly concerned with where Jennifer Dulos was buried. And all of a sudden, our world changed with the pandemic. I think for us, it's just changed how reporters operate, how they set priorities, how they assemble stories. I think if I was to point to one thing in particular, we've learned how difficult it can be when somebody doesn't call you back. We're relying so much on phone and digital communication, you can't run out and find somebody when you can't reach them. So it's really forced us to rethink how we approach stories and where we're going to get our information. We've sought to tell the impact of COVID in the pandemic from nursing homes, people who have died in nursing homes, to restaurants where people have lost jobs, to physicians and nurses who work in hospitals, to high school coaches and high school athletes who can't play their games, to funeral directors and people's experience with death in this pandemic. And all through this, we've been unable to actually go out and report a story, which may seem sort of obvious, but it's when you remove that tool from a reporter, they can't run out and chase a story, it really changes how you go about your job. One series of stories that we worked on that we felt pretty good about was we had a reporter chasing down people who had lost their jobs during the pandemic, a restaurant worker, somebody who worked at Hartford Stage, a woman who worked in catering at Travelers. And what we ran into is when people aren't in their offices and you can't go somewhere to find someone, it's a real challenge to come up with a story. One important thing that we've learned is reporters who have good sources and strong relationships with people, that's really made all the difference during this, because if you know people who will call you back, who will tell you what's going on, then you don't have to rely on what the governor is telling you at his twice weekly press conferences. We think about, for example, we had a very successful series of stories looking at people who died in nursing homes, and particularly one in particular in Windsor. And we had a couple of reporters trying to chase down how people died in the nursing homes, and they weren't able to easily talk to these people face to face. They had to do this largely on the phone and kind of piecing it together, which reporters do often. But when that's your only way of reaching people, you can see how difficult that might be. High school coaches, for example, it's not like you can find them after the game or go to the school and find someone. We had to try to track these people down on the phone when they didn't want to talk to us about what their plans were for practices or games. For us at the Current, we've been a little more strict about sending reporters out on stories. We have not sent them to a lot of events until recently. And I was struck by when a couple of reporters came back this week. A young man went to something in New Britain and a woman went to something in New Haven. And these were reporters who hadn't been out at events because of our concern about the virus. And they came back and they were like, this was great. We were able to talk to people. We were able to follow a lead on a story so much easier because we were there. And it reminded me how difficult it's been to go after stories when we're dependent upon a Zoom conversation or a a press release, and being cut off from the transactional nature of journalism, whether it's casual conversations or meetings and hearings and press conferences. I'm glad Daniela is here with us tonight because she can talk about the challenge it was. She has written about a number of people who have died, and finding people who have died of COVID, which is a challenge because you run into people don't often want to talk about it if a family member has died of COVID, and then getting people to actually talk about the experience. And it's kind of a perfect example of the story that we really struggled to chase, but tried to do a pretty good job at. I guess the other point I'd like to make is, and maybe Christine or Paz would have a perspective on this too, is that when you're dependent upon these official sources of information, like the governor at his briefing or the president or CEO of Hartford Hospital, it's a very much of a one-way stream of information through these carefully controlled Zoom meetings, and it's hard to get at the depth of a story sometimes in that manner. So I guess I would just summarize my experience and my reporters that the toughest part of the COVID virus has been you had to think of new ways to chase a story, and you couldn't just rely on going to press conferences, meeting somebody in a hall, meeting somebody for a cup of coffee, showing up somewhere. All of that has been removed during the pandemic and still is the case.
Rick, I think that creates a perfect segue. We know that COVID-19 really upended everything in terms of how we as journalists do our jobs, and that's engaging and interacting with people, catching up with somebody in the hallway or at an event. For Sarah, what has it been like for you to be behind the camera now? You know, people are staying home, sheltering in place, not outside, and you've got to capture what we endured for the last year. What was it like? How did the pandemic affect your role?
Hi, my name is Sarah Gordon. I'm a photographer at The Day in Southeastern Connecticut, based out of New London. Yeah, as a photographer from home, this term we all love so much, work from home, it really looks a lot different. I joke a lot that it's more like working from your car. Because you can't FaceTime a photograph very well. You can't phone call a visual. And I'm proud to say I don't think we've run any Zoom screenshots of meetings in our paper. I put on real pants with a zipper every day and I leave my house. And while I'm so thankful for that, it's probably the key to my sanity, I think it's a lot easier said than done and has come with its own stress. Especially in the beginning when we didn't really know what COVID was or exactly how it worked. The message was so strong of like, don't leave your house ever. And so it was incredibly stressful to have to. I couldn't find hand sanitizer anywhere, and I carried a gallon of water and hand soap in my car and would wash my hands in parking lot just because that was the only way to do it. And we were and I think the same as the current, our message was kind of the same, where reporters weren't going out that much. In a lot of situations, it would be, okay, this is maybe a numbers game, so we're just gonna send the photographer out. So we would go and we would take notes and capture the scene for reporters and call them from the scene and talk to them and FaceTime them to show them what it looked like. And we'd get phone numbers of people who were there and pass that back to the reporters who were sitting in their house. And that was like something that's really helped us, I think, the whole way through. Obviously things have changed. Reporters are going out a lot more. My camera bag is still full of cleaning products instead of gear though. And the long lenses that I use to shoot sports that aren't happening now, I use to help with social distancing. I have definitely misspelled more names than I'd like because it's really hard to understand people from 6 feet away behind layers of masks. There have been quite a few logistical issues, as you mentioned, with visuals. When it comes to the pandemic, taking photos of testing is really hard and also not that interesting. And it's the same with vaccines. There have been so many situations in the last year involving cars. And journalism is so hard because how do you have a conversation with someone in a car? How do you get someone's name? How do you even get a photo of them if you can't see them? At testing sites, once we were allowed, you kind of focused on the workers because HIPAA law prohibits you from identifying anyone being tested. And food drives, you know, when there's no food drive, kind of a line of cars for food drive looks the same as a line for a car of testing. How do you make that look different? And also in that situation, there's no legalities, but there's still ethics and morals and based in human respect. People are at an extremely vulnerable point, sitting in their car, waiting to get food, waiting to get tested. And the last thing they need is a photo of that moment, front page of the newspaper without their permission. So you run after the car to get their permission when you can. And if you can't, the photo goes in the trash. I definitely gotten more no's than yeses. And that's when I catch the car. And I think also it's like, how do you make the 12th car birthday parade look different from the 11 that came before? If someone has an answer for that, please let me know. And at high school graduations, I joked that it was kind of like playing whack-a-mole. No one was allowed to leave their car except with an escort to the restroom. So you had your head on a swivel, just looking for someone sticking their head out of a window, and you would like cross your fingers that there were some sunroofs. And then how do you make the drive-in church session look any different than the drive-in graduation? I've knocked on a lot more car windows and chased after a lot more cars than I can count this year. And this last year has really been a highlight for me of how for granted we took being able to spend time with people, both personally and professionally, because good journalism takes that time to make a connection with someone. In the old days, whenever I had a portrait assignment, I would go with the reporter and I would just sit there and listen to the conversation, try to get a feel for them, and see what would work visually. Whenever possible, I would talk to someone for a few minutes just to get them comfortable with me before I touch my camera. But now when you meet people in person, especially indoors, there's like this ticking clock going off in your head. I've taken portraits without even saying a word to someone or hurried through it because we were both freezing in the cold. So it's kind of, how do you foster that connection and still make people comfortable in that situation is something that I think we're all kind of working on. Even how do you do that over the phone? I've started calling people ahead of time, especially when I don't have anything to say to them, just to kind of have that small talk chat that I used to have in person so that maybe when I get there, they're a little more open. I don't waste time setting up lights or doing unnecessary things. I just kind of to keep it simple. As a photographer, time also allows for creativity. You would approach events or things with okay, first I'm going to get a good shot, and then I'm going to play around and try to see what I see and do something that someone else might not do. And so that time for that creative approach has really slowed down. I try to spend less time getting that okay shot, and if I'm feeling really crazy, I skip it altogether. But I definitely found myself in a few creative ruts in the pandemic. And it's also really hard to take photos with a mask. The fog goes directly into your viewfinder, and lots of days I'm just shooting completely blind. I can't see what I'm doing. But I am so proud that at the day, we've always had such a high value on showcasing local art in our paper. Even through the pandemic, I can count on the one or two hands the number of times we've had wire art on A1. And that was usually because it was national news and it was a precedence. And I'm not really sure how many other places can say that. We've been able to focus on features, these little slice of life things that we get visually in a way that we haven't been able to in the past. And that's not always easy. So many stories, especially with COVID, are numbers focused. And I don't think anyone wants to see a million photos of people getting something stuck up their nose or something stuck in their arm for a test or a vaccine. And the events that we have always relied on for coverage have really shrunk. Community calendars are empty. So most of our days as a photo staff, we just have been spent driving around looking for features, and somehow magically, one of us always finds something And there are these really beautiful little slices of creativity and adaptation and heartwarming stories of how people are living their lives in this that get beyond the numbers. I've come across a mother and her adult daughter who were parked next to each other in a car on their speakerphones with like playing cards as big as their heads to play a game of cards that they used to play in the stand at the beach they were parked at. I have gone with therapy dogs visiting a nursing home, but instead of going into the building, they wave from outside. I've seen bands kind of play from the back of a flatbed pickup truck as it drove through town. And a bridge that had been under construction for 10 years finally opened, and maybe in another year, in any other year, that would have had a parade. But this year they celebrated it by letting a farmer and his cows cross. So there's always been this high level of trust that has to exist for community journalism to work. Even if they don't agree with how we're covering things or what we write about, that trust is essential for us to do our jobs. And I think for a lot of us, we found that maybe it is harder to do our jobs, but like that trust has proved to be stronger in the pandemic, and we've still been able to make this work.
Well, you've made it work indeed in very special ways. And as a television person, I can tell you that I believe the visual aspect of stories is just important as the word. So, you know, props to you, I'll say, for finding ways to be creative and reinvent the job in ways that you never thought you had to. And also, as you mentioned, finding some of the beauty in the difficult time that we've all experienced. Daniela, you have had the duty of chronicling some of the worst stories that we all lived through in 2020 and continue today, with talking about the loss to COVID and how it's impacted the state in some of the worst ways. Talk some about the work you did over the last year.
So hi, I'm state politics, and I covered the legislature and the governor in normal times, part of the team at the Current. And you know, in February and early March, we were covering the legislative session, writing about bills, writing about, you know, the New Hampshire primary, and really sort of focused on all of that. And then the pandemic hit, and you know, starting, I think in mid-March, I would begin every day at my house with my coffee going through the obits. And that just became a ritual that, you know, sadly continues to this day, you know, just looking at the obits, looking at the stories. And, you know, I think the reason we wanted to do this was because, you know, back at the beginning and continuing on, you know, every day, or not every day anymore, but, you know, periodically, and certainly in the beginning, every day this was occurring, the governor would give a briefing, and he would give, you know, the positivity rate, and he would give the number of deaths, and, you know, there were all these statistics. And we sort of decided, you know, who are these people? Who are the people who are dying? You know, what are their stories? And so that became my job, and, you know, some of my colleagues at the Current, and obviously at other publications as well. We were sort of focused on telling the human toll of this. And for me, you know, that meant interviewing families, sometimes, you know, just really days after their loved one had died. So again, in some cases, especially early on, very suddenly, and people were very confused, and they didn't really know, none of us knew what was going on. And most of these stories were done, you know, on a very tight deadline, because I would talk to the people and then you know, interview them and then write it up. And we would need photos of them. Just to Sarah's point, you know, we weren't going to send photographers to the house of a grieving widow or grieving family to take their pictures. So we would ask them to submit photos, photo of their loved one, whenever they, you know, any kind of picture that they wanted. And so we just started telling their stories, and, you know, we tried to paint a portrait of these people. The model for all of this, as some of you probably remember, after 9/11, the New York Times did the Portraits of Grief series, which really put a human face on this mass tragedy that was 9/11 by telling short stories about each of the people, about their lives, about what they left behind, what they cared about, who they were. So we wanted to do that in this mass casualty event as well, and just sort of tell our readers, this is who is dying. And I guess it had another purpose as well, because, just like I think perhaps with 9/11, there were people who were in denial. People aren't dying. This is a hoax. This is not, some of this rhetoric came right directly down from the White House. Even Trump, after he got sick, COVID is no big deal. And we're finding out, clearly it is. And that was, misinformation. So we wanted to portray the stories of people who are dying from this illness in all their humanity, and also to show people that, yes, people are dying. These are your neighbors, your friends, your family members in some case. And I just think about all the people I wrote about. I mean, there was a guy who was supposed to leave. I called his wife the day after he was brought to the funeral home, and she said, we were supposed to leave for Disney today. Instead, I brought him to the mausoleum, and it was just, it was just heartbreaking. There was a woman who was an LPN in a nursing home in Milford, and she was studying to be an RN. She loved her job, loved her patients. She died. There was a doctor from Wethersfield who liked to fix up old Mustangs. There were 3 members of a church in Norwalk who all died within several days of each other. And I spoke to the pastor there right around Easter, and it was really, really heartbreaking, because he was responsible for leading this congregation in deep grief through the holiest time of the Christian calendar. It was very sad. There was a Holocaust survivor, members of the Greatest Generation who had Alzheimer's, which I think we're starting to learn is a contributing factor to a bad outcome with COVID. A father from West Hartford, a retired teacher who infected his son, and they both died. It was just very, very sad. So just so many sad stories, and trying to honor them all and make sure that you're accurately capturing their lives. It's a big responsibility, and I felt a lot of pressure to really do it right, because families are grieving and people have died, and it's it's hard. There were 3 stories in particular that I really have a hard time. Three people, or actually 4 people, that I have a hard time forgetting. We had a lot of cases, everybody knows about, situations where spouses both got infected and died within a couple of days of each other. We wrote about a couple of them. Other family members, again, who died. There were 2 sisters in a nursing home in Bristol, and they just, talking to their nephew and other relatives, they were just really characters, and they sounded like such unique and fun people in all their kind of idiosyncrasies. They were quite ill, as many people in a nursing home are. They were not in the best health. And again, that's a theme we heard over and over again. These are people who would die anyway. And to me, obviously, to most of us, I think that's very disrespectful, because their lives matter. And these 2 women, they were essentially confined to their nursing home, but they led very rich lives, and they were very, very loved by their family. And I think of them a lot. And there was another woman that I wrote about fairly recently who chronicled her struggles with COVID, including ultimately, the fact that she was dying, on Facebook. And her own words really formed the heart of that story, because there was no way any writer could capture both the horror and the heartbreak of what she was experiencing. She wrote, "I'm losing my battle with COVID. It's now just a matter of trying to keep me comfortable till I pass. I'm ready to go and not be in pain anymore. My oxygen levels have not improved. I love you all. Please pray for my husband. I regret not being able to hold him one more time. This will probably be my last post. Be kind to each other. I love you." And then she posted a couple of music videos, and just absolutely, completely heartbreaking. And we obviously asked her daughter's permission to use those posts because they were just they were extraordinary. And there were several young people we wrote about talking to their parents and their siblings. I wrote a story in November about 3 young people, one man in his 40s and 2 people in their 50s who all died of COVID. And again, they all had underlying conditions, but that shouldn't matter because, why should that matter? I mean, many people have underlying conditions, and it just, it's so heartless when you hear people say that. But there was one guy that I wrote about who was 26, and he worked at the Home Depot, and he died in May, and just was so hard talking to his parents because they were just so incredibly bereft. This was their only son, and it was just devastating. And I'll just read you 2 paragraphs from the story. His father's name was Paulo, and he said, I think his heart just gave out. The cause of death was on his death certificate was listed as blood clots along with COVID-19. After burying their son, Paulo and Elizabeth Ferreira, that's the parents' name, scrolled through his phone and discovered text messages he had sent on a group chat with friends. Pray, he wrote on April 7th. Then RIP me. The final message sent on April 12th, the day before he went into the hospital, said barely alive. This was a man that was suffering incredibly, and he died by himself with just the doctors and nurses to provide him comfort and to hold his hand. And the parents are, understandably just wrecked by this, and it's just incredibly sad. So that's sort of been my focus for the most part during this crisis, and I hope that in some way people understand. I hope that through these stories people will understand that this is a devastating pandemic, and it's really taking a toll on so many people's lives.
The work that you wrote throughout this entire is beautiful, and I think it's especially important that we make real who each one of these statistics are and such stories, particularly in the way that you had to experience how that started was critically important. And just reminding all of us that these people aren't just numbers, aren't just statistics. They all had families, loved ones, lives that they were in before this thing came and changed everything. I want to remind everybody, all of our attendees, that you can enter a question into the chat. If you have a question for the journalists, we're going to have a segment for folks to respond. We're going to have a segment for folks to respond once we get through each one of the journalists. If you have a question about a story or a question about the work that we have been doing over the last year, feel free to put it in the chat and we will get to it when we can. The other big story, or one of the other big stories in 2020 was what we witnessed midway through the year, the racial reckoning, if you will, that came as a result of the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and a number of other largely unarmed Black people, people of color who died at the hands of police or as a result of racial violence. That story, in the midst of the pandemic, took over, and Brian Goodlake from Fox 61 was one of the folks here in our area who covered that. So Brian, I want you to tell the folks about the really powerful work that you did on television covering the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that happened this summer. And then tell us about what it was like for you as a Black man to be a part of that story.
Gotcha. Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Ditlake. I work with Fox 61 News. And yeah, so Fox 61, we did something that was not necessarily known at my station. It all started off with a letter. So during the Black Lives Matter movement, the very first day we saw a protest here in Connecticut, we were in Bridgeport, and we had to cover that entire protest. I ran about a good, I want to say 7 miles following protesters during that time. It was definitely an interesting weekend to see all that unfold and start to develop as time goes on, because during that time you saw nothing but the anger felt in people of color in our community. It was something to behold. You had highways shut down, you had people marching in the streets, demanding justice for a man who they say was murdered in plain sight. And it was such an interesting thing seeing people, no matter what race you are, come out and do this type of protest. So going back to where I say that this whole series started, because we did a 3-part series, all about 10 minutes each, which is not necessarily known in news. Most of our pieces are 1:30 to 2 minutes at the most, maybe 3 minutes if we're having a special. So all of my pieces were about 10 minutes, 11 minutes a piece. You have Black in America, Black in Connecticut, and Voices of Change, each having their own message. But it all started off with a letter that I had to talk to with my news director, Liz. And we had a candid conversation, because while we were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, this was affecting me, because newsflash, I'm Black. And saying, Black Lives Matter, I'm also talking about myself. Yes, I'm impartial. Yes, I am still putting that journalist hat on and, being impartial to our coverage, but I can't be out there singing Lift Every Voice and sing what's the Black national anthem. I can't be out there raising my fist. I can't be out there showing my support and my empathy for a cause that honestly speaks true to me. I'm a Black Southerner. So if anyone knows about racial tensions, it's me. And so I understand exactly where most of these people are coming from when they're sharing their stories at each of these events. And once we had a conversation, I was able to cover George Floyd's funeral first, and talk about how this was impacting me as an African-American journalist. And then that's what actually led to the 3-part series. Black in America was simply to go back into the past, because you can't look at the future without looking back at the past and why African Americans were angry. So Black in America was chosen to address that particular point. And then for our next portion, Black in Connecticut, that was a 10-minute, really, how I want to say this, it was a 10-minute awakening for people in Connecticut, because during that first Black in America piece, we had a lot of people who said that, well, racism doesn't really exist in Connecticut. We've moved on here in Connecticut. And come to find out, we still have a long way to go. And that was the purpose of that. It was supposed to be a wake-up call. Because at the end of the day, people everywhere still has to come to a consensus that, America is a great place to live, but yet it is deeply flawed. And I will always say this, especially since I am a Black man, to be a conscious Black man in America is to always be enraged. And that is a statement that's true back then and it's true today. Because I go home, I'm still a Black man. I go to work, I'm still a Black man. And when I'm reporting the news, I'm still a Black man. And then even during Black in Connecticut, we had comments that were calling me out, calling me the N-word, calling me a monkey. I had comments saying that I'm a police hater. Newsflash for everyone out there. I have parents and uncles and aunties who are on the police force, so I know I'm not a police hater, love them to death. And I also had, just degrading comments towards me and my station, calling us traitors because we work for a Fox station. We're supposed to be leaning towards the right. No, we don't lean anywhere. We're still local news. I'm not going to lean any type of way. And it was such an interesting experience watching people react to these type of pieces that were really meant to wake us up, because during this time, we're supposed to be having uncomfortable conversations. We didn't do this, later on in the year. We did this right during all of the social unrest. And let me tell you, you really saw the reaction from those type of pieces. And then the last portion was Voices of Change, where we look for ways to go forward together. Because at the end of the day, we still have to live with one another and we still have to move forward together. So we talked with different people, from lawyers to police officers to activists, to see where we can find some common ground and move forward in a way that will be constructive for Connecticut and also be an example for the rest of the world. Because unlike the rest of the US, we didn't see the type of violence that we saw in Minneapolis or Atlanta, or even in my hometown of Memphis. we just didn't see that. So it was a good portion of that was trying to highlight the good stuff that we saw during the movement and also bring about an awareness of, hey, you know, let's sit down, let's have some uncomfortable conversation, and let's move forward together. So that's how that whole Black in America series started with us. And we even started continuing it as we've gone throughout the year. We had Living in Color in Connecticut, where we said, hey, you know, we're now seeing less protests, but hey, we still have a lot of work to do. Yes, we have the police accountability bill now, but that's only the very beginning. Let's keep this conversation going, because we'll slip right back into the past if we're not careful. And to answer your other question, Leslie, about how this affected me, it was hard. It was definitely hard, because when you're in these type of stories, it's hard to remove yourself from the story, because during this time, I'm not sure if many people noticed this, but this was the first time that I've seen in my professional career many Black journalists and journalists of color speaking out in a way that shows us, you know, as people. You know, yes, we're journalists and we're on TV, but, you know, at the end of the day, you still have to take that cap off and be a regular person. And it was so empowering seeing not only that from other journalists, but for me, myself as well, and coming out and speaking my own truth. Just to give you all a snippet of my own truth, the reason why I say that I could empathize with the people that were outside protesting is because I come from a different type of background than many people. I can remember back in, I want to say 2010, I was living in Memphis, Tennessee, and headlines had broke out that we had our first integrated prom about 45 minutes away in Mississippi. And I tell that story out here because people are so shocked that that's a thing. No, it's quite normal where I'm from. You know, unfortunately, we still have a long way to go from where I live. And that's not to say that the whole South has racial divides. You know, I'm still a very proud Southerner, and I love our food down there because it's the best food in the world, besides our New Haven pizza up here, which I love to death. But you know, we still have a long way to go with that. You know, I've been pulled over by police, and they had to ask me, you know, why was I driving a BMW at 16? Well, it's my mother's car. It's not mine, but, you know, he thought I stole it. And then you have other stories, you know, that just pile up and that you really don't think about until you have situations like these where you're talking about social unrest and why we are out here and why we have this united force of anger and resentment because you sat there and watched on a social media video 8 minutes of a officer putting his knee on someone's neck, not doing anything, not even resisting, with his hands tied behind his back. And to see that brings up all those other memories that I just mentioned. And while we're reporting this, it's hard to hold back tears because you understand exactly where every emotion that's in the room or in the atmosphere is coming from. And it's just interesting to see that happen and continue to happen now, unfortunately. But it's something that I hope that one day we can all, you know, move past and move forward from, because, you know, America is one of the greatest countries in the world, but, you know, we still have our own demons and flaws. And as a journalist, we will always be here to cover these stories, and we will always be here to give you the unbiased truth about them. But at the same time, I will give you the truth, and I will give you a perspective that you may not have wanted to hear. And that was the whole purpose of that Black in America series, because I wanted to give everyone this unfiltered truth of what it really means to be Black in America.
Well, thank you. And I think you highlighted something that's really important in your work that you did, in that we need voices of color in newsrooms here in Connecticut and also across the country. And I think that not just to cover the racial reckoning that happened this summer, but in general, I think that, you know, we discovered some of the conversations, uncomfortable conversations, I'm sure everyone a part of this panel has participated in. We've learned something about the fact that there's value in different kinds of voices and different perspectives and folks speaking up who maybe don't look like you, haven't had the same shared life experience that you have. And I think for me, covering the events that happened this summer as a journalist, also obviously Black and women, it was certainly interesting to remain impartial and unbiased when we were out in the street and at events, but also, recognizing that, I felt something that perhaps is a little bit different from everyone else. When I watched what happened to George Floyd, and it was also very interesting to see, the fact that we live in a world where there were also still some people who saw what happened to him or some of these other stories that we had to tell. And, they didn't feel so bad about it. And they found ways to explain it away. And they don't think that there are issues with systemic racism or, bias in this country. So it's pretty interesting. This is where I have the uncomfortable duty of transitioning to talk about my contribution to this panel for the evening. So at NBC Connecticut, we started a show at the end of last year called Connecticut in Color that I host. And it's a show that's all about conversations about communities of color in our state. And we wanted to bring this project to light just to highlight some of the voices that often are not amplified in Connecticut. And it's really grown to be a larger franchise and something that we are working to do more with in the state. Something I've been trying to explain to a lot of people who told me they congratulated me on the show, that Connecticut in Color was not born as a response to the events of this summer. It was actually something that we had planned earlier in the year 2020, at the beginning of the year, actually. And then when the pandemic happened, it kind of got pushed down the road because, as we all know, the world was upended. The goal of the show is to highlight, again, those voices of color in our state. Our first episode, we talked to an artist who did portraits of some of the folks who died as a result of racial violence in the country, Trayvon Martin's and Mike Brown's and those Breonna Taylor, all those people. And we talked to him just about what he wanted to represent or the message he wanted to send through his art. We talked about implicit bias training, the police accountability bill here in Connecticut. We also talked to some folks who are trying to help even the playing field for women and minority-owned people of color-owned businesses in our state through funding and different efforts. We're working on a new episode that will air later on this month for Black History Month, and it is all about amplifying, again, those voices of, this time because it's Black History Month, Black people here in Connecticut. So we're doing a lot on their scholarship program to increase diversity in the craft brewing space. It's a partnership with Sacred Heart University and also the Brewing Company. We're also talking to a man who is the first ever Black licensed commercial hot air balloon pilot who lives here in Connecticut and also has just a genuinely exceptional story. Is a man named Bill Costin, who, in addition to flying hot air balloons, has done a number of really cool things. We're highlighting the Queen's Crandall Museum. It's a story of a museum in the state, or a schoolhouse in the state that now is a museum. A woman back in the 1800s started a school that was dedicated to educating Black girls. And unfortunately, because of that mission, the school was destroyed by people who were not so excited about that notion of Black women, young Black women receiving an education in our state. We're also doing some stuff with the Amistad Center for Art and Culture, which is inside of the Wadsworth Atheneum. So I hope that everyone will watch it. It's airing February 27th at 7 p.m. on NBC Connecticut. And I think it's going to be a really great show. It's a half an hour. We're going to be doing them throughout the year, again, highlighting all of the communities of color in our state. And also just in a moment of full transparency and truth, we got the idea for the show when I first moved to Connecticut, which was 5 years ago. I'll never forget that someone said to me, I said, I've got a job in Connecticut, I'm going to be moving. I was in North Carolina at the time. And they said to me, oh, there's Black people in Connecticut? Well, I didn't know. And I think that a lot of folks think that, they have a very kind of monolithic idea of what Connecticut is. And I think even in the state, I can't tell you how many times over the years that I've been here, people have come up to me and they're just excited to see me on the news because I am a Black woman. And they feel that, our voices just have not been heard. And so we wanted to try to amplify the voices of all of the people of color here in our state, just because sometimes I think there are folks who feel like their stories don't get the light that they deserve. So I'm excited to try to help offer a platform to that. And again, I hope you guys will watch, because I think there's something that everybody can learn from the program. So again, that's airing at the end of the month on NBC Connecticut, February 27th at 7 p.m. Now we're going to pivot. And also want to remind everyone again that you can enter all the attendees in the Q&A. You can enter your questions and we will be answering them throughout the question and answer portion of the evening. I want to go now to Kayla Torres-Ocasio from First Media. You did some work on a troubling topic, 10 years of gun deaths and violence in Connecticut. And you guys discovered some really interesting things through your research and your work. Talk some about it.
Yeah, it was interesting because we, as like everyone else, we were kind of swamped with all of this pandemic stuff, coming at us all the time. But in the summer of 2020, a young boy died of a gunshot in New Haven. And so, the news goes on even as the world kind of was, tilted upside down. The other news kind of still happens. And so this boy died, and Helen Bennett over at the New Haven Register, which is one of our papers at her Connecticut, she thought, how many children have died of gunshots in Connecticut? And so she decided to ask the medical examiner for information, and then decided, I'm going to ask for just information for any age, 10 years worth of gun death information. Last year was a really hard year, and still this year still continues for FOI requests, because the officials are not in their offices. So they're telling you, I don't have access to that information, or they're telling you that information is in storage and that storage facility hasn't been opened for a whole year. So getting information was not easy last year through FOI. But this information was actually given to us pretty quickly, within a matter of weeks. The medical examiner gave us that information, and it was definitely interesting to look through this data and to see things that we kind of expected. We expected to see a lot of deaths in the cities. We expected that they would be a lot of young people dying in the cities, a lot of people of color dying in the cities. That was something that I think no one was surprised by, unfortunately. But then we saw the other side of the coin, which was the older populations and the number of suicides among those populations. And I think that for a lot of us was very, like, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? And so we set out to tell those stories of those people because, as everyone has already, pointed out, that's the point of what we do, is to tell the stories behind the data, behind the numbers. That these were actual people, real lives that were impacted by, gunshots, by gun violence. And so it was difficult to, find people to talk to, because, like, everyone has mentioned, you can't go out and find people. And so we were relying on, people knowing other people who might know a source, who might know someone who was impacted by gun violence. And then you have to reach out to them by phone and hope that they call you back. And a lot of these times, a lot of these conversations that you're having about gun violence, about losing a child to gun violence, about losing 2 children to gun violence, a lot of these times you want to have these conversations in person. You want to have that rapport with the person. You want to make the person feel comfortable in telling you this very personal story. And of course, that couldn't happen. We couldn't have the conversations in person. You have to have them over the phone. So that made things a little bit harder in trying to get the stories. And then photos, you can't go, you're not going to people's houses as often, so you're not going inside, you're taking photos of people outside. And how do you capture, in a lot of cases, you would take photos of someone maybe holding a picture of their son, or holding a picture of, or, with a family, a mantle of photos of their children behind them, or, something that's very personal, something very, something that tells a story of this family. And instead, we had to take pictures of them outside. So we had one mother who actually took us to a park that she usually went to with her son. And that was kind of her way of, showing us something that was outside, but that was recognizing her son and kind of the impact that had on her, and the relationship that she had with her son. And so things like that were very difficult to do. And then, of course, we had 10 stories telling these not only the data points of here's how many people died from this kind of death, but then we had also stories of these personal narratives, and pulling all of that together when you're not in the same room with people was so difficult, because you're going through these, especially we had interactives with like little bubbles representing people moving this way, moving that way, and we couldn't be in the same room with each other to go over like, oh, let's print this out and look at it all, together and see how everything matches up, and is the wording correct? Are we being sensitive to this subject and to these people? And you're not in the same room with each other to have those conversations. You're all in totally separate places. So having meetings about the project and trying to get all of the reporters in one place through Zoom when there's difficulties in connections and you can't hear the person, and so having that kind of thing was very difficult as well. But again, we did our best to tell the stories of these people in a sensitive a way as we could, and to really inform the public about an issue that was very serious.
Well, it's critically important. I think even in the midst of the pandemic, it's such an important topic, and one that I'm glad that you guys were all able to tackle. Christine and Paz, you guys saw what you do. It's dramatically changed in just about every way. We're talking about covering state politics, Governor Lamont, and all the things that were supposed to happen on a political front in our state. They all changed because of the pandemic. Can you talk about just what it was like and how you adjusted? As we start.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, the first thing that was different is losing access to the Capitol, and the session that shut down. They were going to take a long weekend in March last year for a deep cleaning of the Capitol and the Legislative Office building, and of course, they never came back. And we learned how much we use all our senses in covering that place. It's not just talking to people; it is watching how people interact in that building. The ability to all the casual contacts you have going into committee rooms where you're maybe not really interested in covering the committee meeting, but there are people there that you need to talk to, and you learn something by just seeing who's attracted to what hearing. So there was that part of covering the legislature, which was lost that year, and it is lost this year because covering it virtually is just not the same. On the political front, yeah, we had to learn on the fly. So COVID was a story to cover. COVID was also a fact in our lives, as Rick, Daniela, and the others have talked about. It limited access to politicians. It limited access to the public to a large measure. So you had to decide how to get a handle on what was happening in America, in Connecticut in 2020. Normally I cover the national conventions. This year, of course, those were virtual, so you lost that. And those are opportunities really to spend time, spend a week with people who are deeply involved in politics, not necessarily the people who are office holders. But, in the case of the Republican Party, there's an older gentleman out in Chaplin, Connecticut named Charles Bruckerhoff, who I covered in 2016. He was a delegate. He's a big Trump guy, former UConn professor, not your typical Trump supporter, very thoughtful, very well-spoken guy. And he was supposed to be a delegate this time. And so I reached back to him, and we kind of contrasted what he's doing this year for Trump versus what he was doing 4 years ago. You had to pick your shots as to what stories you were trying to tell. There was a trend this year of rematches of suburban women who ran 2 years ago, Democrats, and came close but lost. So I picked a couple of them to spend time with, and I ended up focusing on one race in particular in Ridgefield, where John Fry, who is a Republican National Committee member, was not running after a couple of decades, and there was a Democratic woman who had run and came close 2 years ago, and now she was running. And she was largely running because of Donald Trump, and the Republican there was running despite Donald Trump. And so it was an opportunity to tell the broader story about what was happening, those tensions that we see in Connecticut. Certainly in the Republican Party, you have people who are, who are enthusiastic supporters of the former president, and then there were plenty of Republicans who certainly would acknowledge to one degree or another that Trump was toxic for their party. Republicans in Connecticut, even though Connecticut's a solid blue state in federal races, there had been an incredible winning streak that Republicans had from 2010 on, where they really achieved parity in the General Assembly, and they were really positioned to make a bid for their first majorities since the 80s. And then along came Trump, and the dynamic changed. Trying to really tell those stories in the midst of the pandemic, I found to be very difficult. You had your access was limited. There were no large events. You realized how much you rely on different rallies and stuff as far as places to meet people, to see why they were out, why they were so enthused about certain candidates. And so it became a very antiseptic kind of campaign. Eventually in the fall, there was more stuff you could cover. You had to go out and look for it. But it was really a lost year in a lot of ways, as far as how you really track that incredible moment, both covering the pandemic, how the pandemic affected politics, what it said about politics, what it said about candidates. There were layer upon layer upon layer in doing that. And it is something I hope that we never have to go through again that way. The other thing that, the thing I spent time doing is a big part of my job is, again, trying to decide or give people a sense of this governor, who is still very much learning his job in his third year. This is a governor who, his administration, it's almost been like a 3-act play. His first year, was one of the worst first years I've seen of any governor. His rollout of the toll plan was botched beyond belief. I don't think there's much dispute over that. His approval rating was in the 20s. And generally, you don't come back from that. So part of the story of 2020 was the legislature left town. The governor became a manager of a pandemic. He didn't have to worry about the legislature, which is he is still struggling on how to deal with the legislature. And lo and behold, a few months into the pandemic, his approval rating is in the 60s. His approval rating for how he was handling the pandemic topped 70% at one point. And so that was a continuing story of sort of watching his style of government, how he did when he did not have to, again, deal with the questions of how you pass legislation. Now we're back to that. So 2020 really set up what's going on now. And, I wrote a story last week that, again, raises questions about what the governor has learned in his first 2 years about how to deal with the General Assembly. And in fact, the inability of the General Assembly to figure this governor out as well. So that sort of set the stage for Act 3 of this play. So we'll see how it ends.
Yes, we will. Christine, what was your experience in covering the legislature, or covering the state house, covering the governor? And also, you've made the transition to TV in addition to the stuff you do at CT News Junkie. And a final question on top of everything else, with the governor and you guys not being at the Capitol every day in the same way, do you think that how Governor Lamont led the state, or is leading the state, is a little bit different because he didn't have the physical presence of a press corps in the same way that he previously did? Unmute.
The unmute. All right. Oh, I'm unmuted. Okay. Yay. You would think I would have this down by now, but still. So it was really interesting. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I was hired by NBC 30 on like March 16th. So that was like the very beginning of the pandemic. I remember that the studio shut down and I was unable to get my birth certificate to human resources in order to become the full-fledged employee I needed to become. So that was a challenge. At the beginning of the pandemic, we ran out and we got a gaming PC computer because we wanted to be able to stream the governor's press conferences, because all of the information we had was coming from the governor and the governor's press conferences. And we knew it wasn't going to be very long before they were not in person anymore. So we started out in person at the governor's press conferences. What he said, I mean, the beginning of the pandemic was very much getting information to people. Like our job was getting information to everyday people. I think at one point, the unemployment crisis, everybody was unemployed around, by the middle of April, beginning of May, and having trouble accessing those benefits. And, so we almost became like this help desk for the unemployed who were unable to access the Department of Labor because that system was so antiquated and they didn't really have anybody that was able to answer phone calls and whatnot. And so I think that lawmakers too were kind of in this position where they were offering at the very beginning their constituents, constituent service was really important at the very beginning of this. And then, then we have an election in which we can't, we have to offer people the ability to vote by absentee ballot. And how do we do that? Because we know it's dangerous to congregate at a polling place. So a lot of the year was spent just educating people, right? Educating people how to vote by absentee ballot, where to drop that absentee ballot. I think in the summertime, things kind of eased up a little, that some of the candidates who were running for office were able to get out on the campaign trail. So we were able to do some of those more traditional stories where, they would go knock on a door, step back, have their mask on, and be able to have those conversations with people. But I think that they really missed all of that. But what's interesting is all of the female Democratic candidates who ran 2 years ago and lost all came back again this year, and they all went to the campaign school at Yale. They all came back again this year, and they all won their races. And a lot of them, their strategy was really interesting, is that they called all the seniors in their district in March, and they said, hey, this pandemic is happening. Do you need any help? What can I do to get you food? Do you need somebody to talk to? And that was really successful. And, the bill, I'm actually in the state capitol right now. But the building has been closed to the public since March. They were supposed to do that deep cleaning thing. They did come back for 2 special sessions, one in July and one in September. I think that, people forget early on in this pandemic, we also struggled with getting PPE. And that was a really large story. We ran out of stuff from the national stockpile right away. Governor Lamont had to, use his connections in order to get PPE directly from China, from buyers in China. And, I think that the state is still struggling sometimes with that. And that was a lot of the reason. That goes back to, there's so many things that are interconnected. And that goes back to the nursing homes. And that at the very beginning, the nursing home workers didn't have any PPE. They didn't have any masks. I talked to one worker who came in and she's like, yeah, around like March 23rd, somebody came in with a bag of like homemade masks and we all put them on. So it was, it was a very sad thing that we didn't know a lot about this virus very early on and what was happening. And I think that it's been a little bit more difficult to do our jobs. And I have to say that, you know, obviously, not only calling somebody on the phone, that would be easy. If all I had to do now was call somebody on the phone, that would be great. But this is TV, so you need to be visual, and you need to have sound visually. So basically convincing people to jump on a Teams, jump on a Zoom, talk to you and make that connection that way has been a really interesting transition. I looked at my my Teams reminders, and since March, I've done over 201 interviews via Teams for NBC Connecticut, and it's been an amazing year of learning how to present a story in less than 2 minutes with sound and video, and also inform people. I think, you know, we became a little bit more important, and we were taken for granted a lot as reporters. But I think that, you know, especially when everybody was quarantined, there was only one way to get information, and that was through the news. So good and bad this year.
I think that's a perfect way to sum it up. Good and bad, and also lots of pivots. We have one more journalist with us tonight, Jackie Thomas. We want to talk about the work that you did, because it's different from COVID, but also it's very important in that you did reporting on housing poverty, exclusionary zoning. I probably can't do justice to explain the work that you did, so explain your projects to the folks who are listening tonight. And also, I want to send one more reminder to the audience to enter your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them before the end of the night.
Hi, so I'm an education reporter for the Connecticut Mirror, and you know, I've spent so much of my time sitting in schools, watching what's happening, having teachers tell me their stories about what they're seeing in the classrooms. You know, one story that stood out several years ago, shortly after I had the luxury of sitting through the school funding trial, and you know, then I went back into the classrooms to do reportings outside of the school funding trial. And Richard McHugh in Hartford, he was the Hartford Teacher of the Year in the neighborhood in Frog Hollow. And, you know, he started talking to me about all the housing insecurities that follow these children to school. And so this wasn't the first time that a teacher or a student or a parent had shared those issues of how that's impacting their education, and it won't be the last. But it really was a project that I wanted to work on for so long, because so much of what happens in school is based on housing insecurity and what's going on at home as well. And so what I had the benefit of spending an incredible amount of time just researching and essentially learning a new beat of housing and what shapes where housing goes in our state of Connecticut. And through a partnership with ProPublica, I got to work on that exclusively for a year. That partnership actually ended, formal partnership ended at the beginning of last year, January 1st. But I was still doing several follow-up stories. You know, I had several, I had just gotten an FOI from HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, like 2 weeks before the first COVID case struck down. And you know, I still am waiting to get to that story, because, you know, that's a pretty big project to do, or a pretty big story to do and tackle. But I've just been sort of sidelined by so many other housing stories that have needed to be raised during this pandemic. On the stories that I did work on that have published this year, you know, I spent a lot of time developing sources. And so I worked with a lot of mothers who were having housing insecurity. Crystal Carter comes to mind. She had a housing voucher that she received, but she couldn't find anywhere to use it. And so, you know, there was a lot of ups and downs during, you know, the year that I was following her, longer than that even, of not knowing if in the end she would be okay with me sharing her story. But still, I wanted to hear her story. I wanted to know her experience. It helped me better understand what folks were going through. But she was terrified that she was going to lose her voucher if she went to the press and shared how hard it was to use her voucher anywhere. In the end, I gained her trust, and she trusted me to tell her story, and she was incredibly happy with how the story went. And I got a flood of emails from people in reaction to the stories, but the one that mattered the most to me was from her saying, like, thank you for telling my story. To get to some of the policy sides behind the story of why it's so hard to use a voucher in different parts of the state. I really relied on academic research that's out there, or research that different municipalities have in fact paid for. And to do that, those reports weren't always necessarily readily easily available. So one that comes to mind is the Connecticut Economic Resource Center was paid to do a report on the housing set up in Hartford, and that showed that in Frog Hollow, the neighborhood of where Richard McHugh was a teacher, that sort of stood out to me about all the students who were coming to school. 75% of the houses in that community were restricted for low-income housing, and so finding the paper trail behind sort of just how concentrated low-income housing is in certain communities, and the reason why that's important for education is because Connecticut has one of the highest rates. I think it's the second highest rate the last time I looked, on its reliance on local property taxes to pay for schools. And so if you have predominantly low-income housing in your community, that means you don't have the revenue you need to pay for things like bilingual educators, or counselors, or after-school programs, or all the things that come with needing to run a high-quality school. And so, another report that I had the luxury of spending a week trying to track down how we compare nationally on where we're actually citing our low-income housing tax credit properties, so the largest source of federal funding to build affordable housing. I was like, there has to be research out there on this. And, I talked to a lot of people throughout the year, and nobody knew if there was any research anywhere. And so I just spent a week reading a lot of research, and I stumbled across it. So it's something, stories that take time to sort of, and it was like 2 sentences in my story. So I hope somebody appreciated those 2 sentences in the story. I did when I got it. I thought I found a gold mine. It turns out Connecticut cites its low-income housing tax credit properties at twice the rate, the national average. So we're not doing well. So my suspicion was right, and that week that I spent tracking that report down was well worth it. When it comes to sort of, that was just the first couple months of the year, and then COVID hit, and sort of how I reported on housing was transformed overnight. All of a sudden I'm writing about how the state is providing mortgage relief but not rental relief. And if you look at who's renting compared to the demographics of who owns a mortgage, it's stark. The state has since provided some rental relief after Congress provided some aid for that. Also wrote about how people living in motels don't qualify for housing assistance. Wrote about the rent burden, and how while there is an eviction moratorium, there's several loopholes that allow for many, many people to still be evicted. And throughout all of that, trying to find people that are actually impacted by those policies was insanely difficult, because typically I would, go and walk around neighborhoods and talk to people, and that wasn't really possible. I had to sort of use my sources and rely on them to help share other people's stories with me, and get comfortable with people over the phone to sort of let me in their life that way. So unlike Sarah, I did not wake up every morning and put on pants, or a pants with a zipper. I actually came to several morning staff meetings in my bathrobe, to which Taz finally called me out for doing that one morning. But yeah, so life changed a lot because of COVID and how I reported housing. So.
Well, you still did great work. And, I don't think there's any judgment for not wearing pants with a zipper, gives you all that I've experienced over the last year. I'm going to send it over now to Kate, who is going to try to get to some of the questions that we have from the audience.
Great. This was fascinating, everybody. Thank you so much. I've got two questions from Victoria Sundquist that are terrific. I'll start with the first one. What have you learned during the pandemic that you think you might now make part of your everyday life, even when things return back to, quote, normal? I guess anyone who'd like to tackle that one.
Well, I will say we're definitely keeping the Zoom for broadcast media. This is a favor for all of us. And I would say that learning from the pandemic, that it taught us that sometimes, yes, we can find new ways to tell the news and be comfortable in a way that we can say how we can talk to officials through Zoom or talk to people through Zoom that we haven't had in the past. So that's one thing that I will definitely be taking with me as we go further once we get back to our new normal.
Great. Anybody else?
I think it's been a game changer for us in TV, not having to go far away and being able to get interviews and content from folks who might not otherwise be able to reach. Christine?
Yeah, I was just the use of technology. And the cell phone and the computer from NBC showed up at my house and they were like, go get interviews. And I was like, for TV? Yeah, get people on camera. Oh, okay. I can do this, sure. And so I just took a big gulp and I did it, and I didn't break anything.
Good, thank you. Next question, what information is less likely to get out to local communities during a pandemic, and how can you as a journalist address that? Good question. Who wants to take that one on?
I mean, I think we're very sensitive now to the digital divide, and you know, we get so reliant on the technology, and I think the pandemic has taught us to be more aware. You know, certainly as you watch the struggle in some of the communities of older people, for example, to use a system that requires an email address, you know, things like that. So I think this whole pandemic has laid bare a lot of the disparities in Connecticut. And I think that's going to be a lasting impact of how we look at these issues. But as far as getting the information out, I mean, it's, you know, there is the shift to digital, you know, television, radio, newspapers, news, you know, it's happening faster than anybody thought. You know, I'm older than most of the folks on this call, but, you know, I don't watch TV, whether it's news or anything else. I get those videos when I want to see them. And, you know, so it's harder for, I think, for the communities that don't have broadband access and so forth. And I think that it's a challenge for the media to figure out, again, how to do that basic job of having a broad, diverse audience.
Great, thanks. Kayla, it was interesting to hear that you got the gun data fairly quickly, even during a pandemic, but that's not typical, is it? That the access to information is often very slow.
Yeah, it's not at all. So I'm investigations editor for Hearst, Connecticut, and we put out a lot of FOI requests, my team. And no, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, we've had people tell us, you know, state agencies tell us, oh, all of our records are in a big storage facility, and that hasn't been open, you know, in months. We've had them say, I'm working from home, I don't have access to those documents. A lot of times when you request documents, you're asking for information where there might be a whole lot of it. And so you usually have the opportunity to go in and look through the documents and then make copies of whatever you want, instead of, you know, asking for documentation and getting, you know, 650 pages worth of stuff, which, you know, it's like 50 cents a page. So So you know, you don't have that option. You don't have the option of going in and sitting in at a desk with a bunch of boxes in front of you and sorting through data or documents. So it was incredibly difficult. It continues to be incredibly difficult to get information out of especially public agencies.
Kate, I'd also
Thank you.
add
Yeah,
that,
go ahead. Yep.
that
Go ahead, Rick.
one of the things that's going to come out of this is that government is getting less scrutiny. And, you know, I think that we're losing track of keeping an eye on our local town council, our local board of education. And part of that acceleration of everything that the pandemic has caused. But it's very concerning that we're losing scrutiny of where money is being spent, how our kids are being educated, who's getting jobs. And I don't have an answer for that, but I definitely think that that's going on now.
I just want to add that it's also easier for somebody to just, you know, to hide, to not return your phone call, to, you know, disappear on you, not be. It's harder to hold them accountable in this day and age because they can just, you know. And you know, what are we doing about access to those Zoom chats, access to the information that is being created through this? And I'm sorry, but I don't have 13 hours to sit through a labor and public employees public hearing, and those hearings have gotten longer because they're all online now.
Great points, all of you. Next question from Emily Kavanaugh. Do you think COVID had an effect on the recent racial reckoning with Black Lives Matter protests and movement advancements? If so, what were some of the effects? I guess for Leslie and Brian, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think COVID absolutely was a game changer. And I think part of the reason the movement took off in the way that it did is because so many more people were at home. So many more people had the time to watch that video of what happened to George Floyd. I think that that's also part of the reason we saw the diversity in the protests that we saw this summer. Was because so many people who maybe wouldn't have been connected to what was going on had a moment to learn something new and discover some of these issues, right?
Yeah, Leslie, you hit it on the head. Just because we have all been inside the house, you had no way of not seeing the video that happened with George Floyd, and seeing it right in your face is, I think, what sparked all of these protests that we saw every single where, even not here in the United States, but overseas as well. You know, all of us had to look at these horrific images. And then when it happened again in Kenosha and happened again somewhere else, you constantly had images in your living room or on your phone that you couldn't avoid anymore because we're all stuck inside the house because of COVID. And furthermore, when we were outside protesting, you know, yes, it was not technically safe to be out there. It still isn't safe to be out there, you know, while this virus is ongoing. But you have to remember that people were so upset, especially for people of color who are disadvantagedly affected by this virus across the board, economically and health-wise. To go outside and protest during a deadly virus will show you how much this had majorly, how I say this, really pissed them off. For lack of better words. And to protest and risk their lives to protest this type of inequality that's been existing in our country for generations at this point.
Thanks, everybody. This has been a great celebration of journalism and the great work you've done. I'm out of questions, so back to Leslie.
Okay, thank you. And that will do it for our panel and the 2020 happening in 2021 Stories Behind the Stories, brought to you by the Connecticut Foundation for Open Government. I want to say thank you to each one of the panelists for being here, and thank you to all of our attendees who are with us virtually this year. Here's to hoping that in the future, at some point, we can hop off of these platforms and be back together in person with one another. And I would also encourage everyone who is participating and watching tonight to support CFOG, support the work that they do. It's really important, and I think that some of the answers you've heard tonight explain why journalism is so important, why the work that all of the people on this call do continues to matter, and I hope that you'll support that, because there is a few things that matter more than a free and open and able press. So have a great night, everybody, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you. That was wonderful.